was published in 2018, and his second book, The Age of Pandemics, very prominent one, from 1817 to 1920, How They Shaped India and the World, was published in the year of the pandemic, 2020. So a big round of applause for him as well. Now I would like Professor Aloka to come and present. A big round of applause, guys.
Good morning, and let me begin by saying that I'm most happy to be here at the Centenary year, historic as everybody has said this morning. And I also want to thank the Centenary Committee for organizing the seminar and inviting me. And had it not been for Professor Seema, who kept persuading me, maybe perhaps I would not have landed up over here. So thank you very much, Seema, as well. I also thank all of you for beginning the symposium, the seminar, with Histories from the Margin. And as the abstract indicates, I'm going to be talking about belonging and fragments, travelers along the Karakorum. So of course, one can say if we are looking at the Karakorum from the Ganges Valley, then this is marginal. Maybe even from the lower Indus, that is the Punjab plains, it is marginal. But I'd really like to stand on the various sites where I get my fragments. And if you're standing at the center of this region, then you're in the center, you're not in the margin. But more importantly, what I want to emphasize is that though I'm going to be illustrating my talk with these travelers and the fragments they left behind at various sites along the Karakorum, the important thing is that we very rarely discuss the region per se. And this was a region inhabited by diverse communities, so much so that Kreutzmann, when he did his linguistic survey of this area, 2005, he published an article. He suggested that even though the government of Pakistan was trying to sort of suggest that Urdu should be, being the national language, should be disseminated amongst the people, 95% of the people said that their language was other than whatever is the national language. So this is not long ago, 2005. And of course, the indigenous populations between the Hindu Kush and the Karakorum, these are the people, as all of you know, the Brokamas, the Daradas, the Baltis, and other tribes of Baltistan. So basically this region is what is called Gilgit-Baltistan. But the important thing about this region is that we have a series of valleys that bifurcate from the upper Indus. So I don't know if some of you have been following contemporary news, but there's this big Karakorum highway that has been constructed from 1956 to 1979, Pakistani and Chinese government. But we are looking at the river Indus, along the river Indus, but we're also looking at the northern bank of the river Indus. And so there are these, what Jason Nealis, whom you'll be hearing this later, says are the capillary routes that bifurcate from the Indus up into the Gilgit area. So I'm going to focus on south of Gilgit. There is a very important place called Chilas, and Chilas is the district headquarters of what is called the Diyamur district of the northern areas. And just to the west of it, and a bit to the east of it, are various places that have been recently documented and excavated, but not excavated so much as documented. A lot of epigraphic work has been done and documented by a combined German team of scholars along with Pakistanis, of which of course Dani, the famous Dani, was a major collaborator. So this group of the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences has brought together several sites like Oshibad, Hodar, Shatial, Thaplan, Thor, you name it. And they've done a very, very fantastic documentation. I was gifted this volume on Oshibad. So I'm not going into the details of the editors, etc. We can, if you want to know more about it, I can talk to you about it later. So I did a detailed study of two places. One is Chilas, which was already done by Dani in 1983, I believe. And Oshibat, I did myself because this thing was landed on my lap, so to speak. And what I found was that much of what they documented is in fragments. So the title of my paper, Belonging and Fragments. So what do we do? So now I mean, maybe perhaps if there's any contribution that I make to this is that we need to problematize a fragment, and we have to look at histories of belonging or histories coming out from these regions. But the data that we have, or the data set that we have, is necessarily in a fragment. So fragments can be anything from inscriptions to small text to oral fragments, anything. But materially as well as at an ideation level, they talk about past lives and they talk about past peoples. Sigurd Gieden in 1948 and then later in 1970 as well, he wrote, and I quote, "History writing is ever tied to a fragment." What does that mean actually? For every period, he has a subtitle to his book called The Anonymous History, because an advertisement or a small label alongside the road, etc. This is all part of history, but we pay very minimal attention to it. And what he argued is that all this is an integral part of what the everyday in our lives is about. The fragment is about our everyday. And then I followed up on what archaeologists and others look at, because it's quite legitimate for archaeologists to use a fragment. In fact, the fragment is used as a kind of a corroborative material when you're looking at very, very ancient periods. And Frelo and Owen, in their famous book on objects and meaning, say, and I quote, "Regardless of scale, form or function, they are objects found in fragments. Their meaning is couched in a non-verbal language to be received, perceived and tactfully visualized." And similarly, of course, in more recent history, Abbadurai and others, the social life of small things, have argued that individual artifacts, small objects, etc., they generate biographies. Every small thing generates biographies, but the important point is that we must stand locally to have these biographies written into history. So that's a little general thing that I have mentioned about the problem of how maybe we can bring the fragment into our discourses. About the region, the historiography, I have a big section on that in the paper, but you know, the British have been there, the French have been there, the Italians have been there, and now the Germans have been there. Of course, the Italians worked in the Swat Valley, Fouché and others looked at Gandhara, Bactria, etc. The British, of course, as you know, Marshall and Wheeler and all, looked at Taxila and so on and so forth. And this new set of scholars, there's a whole new set of scholars that has been looking at the Karakorum sites. They call them field stations actually. They are using the German material to write about names there. For example, Harry Falk has written about what do we do with names and titles of the well, some of them could be in Kharoshti, some of them could be in Sogdian, some of them could be in Brahmi, and they range, the range is like from the early centuries BC right up to the 10th century. And that is what is fascinating. That is what is fascinating about this place, that occasionally the writer of the inscription or the name will be given, but in most cases we will not get the name of the writer, or we will not get the name of the author, so to speak. So let me briefly tell you about Chilas, because when I looked at the two materials that came out of these two sites, Chilas is obviously a major, let's say, dividing site, because the river over there turns, and so it's very easy to cross the river around there, and so also at Oshipat, and so also at Hodar. So what happens over there in Chilas is that the kind of material that you have is more or less like the inscriptional material that we find elsewhere on the subcontinent. For example, you have the names of kings or their genealogies, the destroyer of enemies, and in fact, Dani tells us that the old name of Chilas was Somanagara, and there was a king, a ruler called Sri Vaishyaravana Sena, and there are lots of names with Sena ending and Pala ending, names, Suchi ending names, and Mitra ending names. So it seems familiar. This kind of material seems a little familiar to us. And what I've done is I've documented all these names to get a pattern. Because with fragments, one thing that we need to do is we need to get a pattern of the kind of naming that is happening and in what periods. One example, for example, is of a person called Gopadas Balaputra. And he is standing near a very fat-bellied person, seemingly captured, and soldiers in Scythian dress are kind of dragging him. So there is not only the name, but then there is also an illustration. Similarly, another very interesting example is Baladeo Vasudevo, and this, according to Dani, is the first iconographic representations of these gods, deities holding a spear, ending with a plow, and a discus respectively. And then the words Ramakrishna, Krishnasa Dharmaputra is a little further up. Now, there is no organization in the way all this is put down, right? And the dating is done based, so the Kharoshti inscriptions are the earliest, which Fussman has identified. Then there is a whole range of Brahmi inscriptions, but there's also late Brahmi in kind of Scythian style, and then there is what is called a proto-Sharda script, which is almost like a proto-Nagari script. So this material that gets reeled out is of this kind. A very interesting conclusion of the Chilas names is that towards the later period, there is a kind of hybridity. So they are not kind of Sanskrit names. They sound Prakrit, but they are not even Prakrit. There's a kind of a mixture kind of thing. So in the fragment that we are looking at, perhaps we are looking at newcomers to the area. Dani's opinion is that these were probably the Hunas who forgot their own Hunnic language, and then they started using Sanskrit, but they couldn't kind of get to remember the proper Sanskrit, so they made their own names, and he's given us some examples. And then he says that these names are still preserved in the nicknames of the Sina people of the region, right? So there is a kind of a connectedness. As far as Jati, Varna, etc., there are hardly any Jati ending, we don't get to know, except for the Brahman. So there is a Pandata, Shukra, Maheka, or at Oshibat, for example, there's an Ashoka Brahmana, there's a Kirti Bhushan, somebody. But generally, caste identity is not. If you want to analyze the names, maybe you'll get a large majority of both at Chilas as well as at Oshibat, a large majority of the names and phrases are those of the Buddhists. So naturally what has happened is that a lot of scholars have been looking at the Buddhist context of the transmission of culture from the plains, by plains I mean the Indus plains, into Central Asia, right? So this zone, the Karakorum zone, is looked at as a kind of a transitory zone. So that's the major argument that they make. But my argument is a slightly different, because if you sort of, if you monumentalize everything within the domain of this is Buddhist history, then you're forgetting the particularity of the place and the particularity of the names. So for Oshibat, for example, because I had this material with me, what I did was I classified that name to just give an argument, and that's what I said in the thing, that there are diverse communities of travelers. So are we talking about a traveling community, or are we talking about groups of travelers? No, what I did was that apart from Ashoka Brahmana and Pandit Kirti Bhushan, etc., there are names like Ishana, Sri Rudra, Vaishnavite names like Sri Jai Vishnu, Sri Vishnu Rakshita, Sri Madhava. Then of course there are clearly Vajradhira, Buddha Dharmaka, Mitradatta, Bodhisattva, etc. So when you classify the name, 230 Brahmi inscriptions, and the data set was 230 Brahmi fragmentary inscriptions. 36 of them were Sogdian, that were translated by Sim Williams. 9 were in Kharoshti in Oshibat, that was translated, transliterated, not translated. I translated them, was Fussman. And of course, there were just a few that were in Sharda. So when you look at this pattern, then you say that over time, there was a changing pattern of the travelers that were moving from the plains, the Indus plains as well as the Ganges plains into Central for whatever reasons. Some of them went for trade, some of them went for religious purposes, and so on and so forth. And the only thing other than the names are very quaint but very interesting phrases, like one which gives the name of the writer called Namo Buddha Vasuchandra Divara. So for the first time, you have an example of a writer, of course, obviously praising the Buddha. Same another Devo Dhammo Yamaraho Virasya. So these are all about the religious foundations of Buddhism. But to me, the most fascinating one at Koshibat was Martamya Samartyam. That means man should remember that the day of death is fixed. And why would these people be writing these names, reminding themselves about, the conditions under which they traveled? The routes kept changing. Why? Because the climate, the challenging environment, the changes in the way in which the river basin, etc., due to weather conditions, etc. All this has been written about, and it was like very difficult for travelers to actually remember that they had to reach safely to their point of destination. Now, let me come towards the end. What I have said in this paper is that there are 4 frames of writing histories of belonging. Nobody in the political history of this region ever talks about the Tibetan Empire of the 1790s or the 780s and 790s. But everybody talks about the Macedonian Greeks and the Achaemenids and the Kushanas, of course, in a large amount. But Gilgit-Baltistan was an integral part of this Tibetan Empire, and which of course is sort of not discussed at all. And why I'm emphasizing the Tibetan Empire is because the 7th century to 10th century inscriptions, which are in late Brahmi and in Sharda, they continue to give us a lot of data set, whereas in the rest of India we are talking about the growth of feudalism, the decline of trade, and this, that, and the other, right? So the interesting thing is that this region gives you a different kind of a take. People the number of travelers do not reduce. Technically, theoretically, if we use these other frames of reference, rise of Buddhism, great urbanization, etc., etc., there can be a religious frame, there can be an economic frame, and the social frame. Look at the social frame. The social frame is because we are looking at it from the point of view of the Ganges Valley, right? And the Ganges Valley texts are talking of this as Mlecha Desh. And forget about these people, they are Mlechas. These are all these Yavanas and Kushanas and Kuharas, etc., etc. So there is a kind of a negation about what. But if you look if you stand over there and you see a very vibrant kind of a society that is continuing to travel. Both the Chinese pilgrims, Huaiyan and Hunsai, traveled through this region, and I have documented them non-Buddhist, non-Brahmanical names and images. And there are a lot of illustrations and imagery of like hunting scenes of war. I actually call it graffiti at some places because in some places it looks like graffiti, like a broad game like squares or the sun or the moon or some scribbling of some sort or the other. So this is really talking about people, right? We are talking about people hanging around there, waiting for the weather to improve perhaps. And the important thing is that in all this transition or transmission, they are being helped by the local people, right? The Sogdians, for example, were not allowed to enter through the normal route because they were not Buddhists. So what they used to do is they used to travel north of the river, and obviously the local people used to let them go up there to sell their goods and so on. Similarly, there is a lot of overwriting of the fragments. So a lot of Shivalingas are written over by stupas, or stupas are overwritten by flags, trishulas and so on. So let me conclude by saying that that questions of identity, I would say, remain intact. But none of the travelers are talking about themselves in terms of their kinship community, their village community, and such like things. I would say that it is these inscribers of individual names wanted their names to be written about, but they were also making a history. These names are also enabling us to understand the centrality of the space where they were writing these names. We should not be only looking at the other four frames that I was talking about the trading frame or the, sort of the religious frame and all that. We should also be talking about the particularity of the non-religious and the everydayness of a traveler, what he would like to express himself in these fragments. And to end with the 7th century quotation, traveler, Buddhist traveler Hin Sang, who wrote, and it's a part of a large quotation, he writes, many miraculous circumstances occur in the mountain. Sometimes a stone barrier is split across. Sometimes on the mountain top there are remains of the traces of horse. But all things of this sort are only mistaken traces of the Arhants and Shravanas, who in troops frequent this spot, and with their fingers trace these figures, as if riding on horses or going to and fro on foot, and this has led to the difficulty in explaining these marks. I would suggest it's high time we begin to explain these marks, even if it is graffiti, even if they are marginal to our sensibilities of understanding the magnitude of trade, religion, Gandhara art, etc. They still give us a distinct identity of the everydayness of the traveler. Thank you very much.
It was an excellent presentation, and we can have a short. No, please come. We can take a few questions.
Yes.
Permission?
Yes.
If anyone has a question,
This is Allahabad Bhardwaj. Namaskar, this is Allahabad Bhardwaj, teaching ancient Indian history in a college in the university. When I last met you a few years ago, and you spoke on the same topic, kind of, I had asked you, madam, how did they converse when they were, people from different regions? So who helped them interpret their languages so that sale of merchandise could take place?
Yes. So, yes, it is true. Andre Link, who looked at this region in a later period, he says that many of the dialects that were spoken in the area were what he calls Indo-Iranian dialects. That's point one. And point two, as I was trying to show, that there is a kind of hybridity. People were conversing with each other. It's like Nagamese, for example. So it's like a mixture of different things. But that they have written down names in Sanskrit, in Kharoshti, Brahmi. They came with a certain linguistic background, and then they had to interact with the local people, right? So Balti, Dardi, etc., not very different in sound. Of course, the phonetics would be different, the dialects would be different. It's like when you're traveling, let's say, across the foothills of the Himalayas, like, the Hindi will not be exactly like the Hindi that you know. So obviously, because for a long period, by the way, I forgot to mention that this is also a site of a very major prehistoric imagery. Like there are things petroglyphs going back to the Neolithic times, early Neolithic times, and then continuing right up till in Oshibat, out of the 46, about 30 of them are actually of hunting scenes. So I do imagine that all these people didn't become urban dwellers, right? They were still nomads, still pastoral nomads carrying on, and they were the ones guiding the people up those, what Jason Nealis calls capillary routes. So you imagine the river Indus here, they have to cross the Indus and they have to take these routes. By the way, for those, of course, amongst my colleagues who have looked at the history of Bactria, etc., that was a longer route. They did that longer route at some point in time became defunct. Defunct because of war, political activity. This route, as early as 1957, A.K. Narayan said that this route was shorter, but it was treacherous, right? So they used this route to travel. Now, names and all that is not very new. Even in India, in Sanchi, in the Buddhist cave temples, Ahmedabad, etc., we have names inscribed. But the point over here is that the names are inscribed on rocky surfaces. Some of them are literate, some of them are illiterate, and therefore these are not. There's Mary Kay von Elde in 2019. She wrote a wonderful article about saying that the stupa and the Buddha images and on the Karakorum sites is exactly like what you find at Gandhara. My point is that this kind of trying to find the classical in the local is like problematic. I mean, they made it, they may have remembered the Gandhara, but did classical artists actually travel to that place to make the Buddha images and all? I doubt it, right? So there is a kind of a learning process, and there's a kind of, what is the demand? My demand is trade. I want to make money. My demand is this religious fervor to carry my faith across, right? So I want to communicate with people. These Sogdians, they are the only ones who were rejected by the major groups over there because they were not Buddhists. So they had to, use the local people to travel to the other side of the river Indus. And there they used to sell without paying tolls, without paying taxes. Pakistanis information. There's another scholar called Azam Chaudhry, a Pakistani, who has done fantastic minute work on the locality, which I think that we are ignoring. I've used a lot of his work in my paper.
Okay, I think Seema.
This side.
This side is
Okay, so we have 3 questions coming up.
Very quickly,
1,
I just
2,
ask
and 3.
one that all along this region, Chillas and other sites, that even small boulders along moraines are being used to inscribe and for graffiti-like marks. So are these, could these be path markers, especially in that morainous region? Secondly, for me, I think what little I have read, that the Buddhist images or other images are placed in certain important areas, which are passes or transitional areas, where sacrality of that particular place becomes important. But do you think that's true? Maybe I'm overreading it or not? I don't know.
No, it's very quickly. But very quickly, the answer is very quick. They become pathways, they become path marks. But the point about the Buddhist images being on it, obviously a lot of Buddhism traveled along there. There's no denying that fact. But at Oshibat, there's a rock called Rock 18. And Yatmar over there says it's not Buddhist. The Buddhists come and take that over because it has an auspiciousness. So it's the other way around as well. So that's the point I'm trying to make. It's not the Buddhists who make it sacred, but that they were already sacred places for the...
Thank you very much for that. Actually, I want to compliment the thing that you mentioned, that it's not the classical to the local, but it's the other way around. So, and this is beautifully, we can see it beautifully. So we can see beautifully about the coin, the marks you have talked about, the Balaram and the Vasudeva and the Sankarsana elements. So the same kind of, if you just, we had the picture, then we could see that how Agathocles' coin and this, they have the same kind of thing. So therefore, it's very natural that these kind of images were moving around. But on the question of Professor Bharadwaj, I would also like to make a small submission that I am aware that Dani had written about this. But when we go a little later further, we find the Sogdians, as you mentioned also, a very strong element. And so then that they were not introduced, they were not accepted, that doesn't occur anymore. And when we look at Shatiyal particularly, we have this famous inscription of Nanai Bandha, where they are coming and the sacrality of the place. So it is like, as you just mentioned, that the place is sacred, then the Buddhists come and take over. So they had the beautiful images of the Buddhas, and then the Sogdians come. And at one point of time, talking about the language, what language they were speaking, it was Sogdian becomes the lingua franca for the entire thing in the 3rd, 4th century.
And sometimes,
So
at some point,
in the 3rd, 4th century, and then where. And
But
later
not for all.
no, not for all.
What's your
I'm
question?
particularly talking of.
What's your question?
So that, no, that is what I'm
That's the
saying,
comment she
that
wants
I'm a
to
comment, in an answer to.
Yeah. No, so no, you are right, but I forgot to mention there are 30,000 petroglyphs, 5,000 inscriptions, and 10 writing systems in this area. Okay, so I'm only talking about Oshibat, I'm not talking about Shatiyal, and I'm also not talking about Hodar and Thaplan. Those places have got larger imagery, and this Merike Fan Arthur, and of course, Jason Nevis has done several articles on the whole question of migratory routes, Ushrana migratory routes, and those symbols indeed are what I mentioned it in the paper. But my point is not that. Why those 4 frames of reference should be our frames of reference for this locality?
That is well taken,
Yeah.
ma'am.
No, but the point is not, you see, Suchandra, but what happens is that when we take these 4 frames of reference, of looking at it from, let's say, the political or the economic or the religious, then we are ignoring the minuteness of what the offering of the local is. That's the point. Right? We must stand in the local. So, Oshibat Rock 18, Yatmar, who was the first person who did this, he said this was sacred for generations. So when people come to that rock, even today, that rock is respected. And so I think that in these very treacherous areas, we need to be looking at a different kind of a history. And the fragment must be made central to it, rather than us finding a kind of a magnitude of patterns. Yes, I agree with you. Those patterns we should look at. Yes.
So my name is Vikas Rathi. I don't do ancient India, but my question comes out of interest in, you talked about these spaces were accessed by various sects at different points of time. So I just wanted, you to elaborate a bit on what kind of, how did this happen? Are we talking about the exact same spot? Are we talking about different sects accessing this space at the same time, one after the another, in a friendly manner or in a contentious manner? So if you could just elaborate on that. Thank you.
Before you answer the question, as the chair, I have a little request to make. Usually it happens in seminars and presentations and so on that people end up commenting on papers, and these comments then run into several minutes and become presentations themselves. So that at the risk of, I'm risking my popularity by saying these things here, that please be brief in your questions. The questions should be addressed to the presentation. If it's something terribly serious about which you need to discuss something with the presenter, you can always do it over a cup of tea outside the hall or over lunch or whatever. But please, unless everybody is pointed in their questions, other people will be denied the chance to ask their questions, and we don't have the entire day for this session. We have to, now this Q&A will be over in about 2 minutes, after which the other presenters have to. Yeah. I don't think you need to add anything to what I have said. Because you always end up adding something and then you speak, you give a lecture. And you have just become a member of the AC. Anyway, I am making an exception. No, because just an exception. Give him the mic.
No, it's very simple. I was wondering, B.D. Chattopadhyay, in his representing the other, makes this point about the importance, the instructions that people gave to the provenance, the place of origin. So how do you see that in your work? I mean, that's what it's very
There
good
is,
question.
thank you, yeah.
Anirudh, I was brief.
Yeah, right. To answer your question, I did mention that these inscriptions or fragmentary inscriptions date from roughly around the late 3rd century BC to about the 10th century CE. So all the travelers with the different kinds of names, they don't belong to one period. But the point about contestation is very significant because there is some imagery of sort of people sort of attacking the other. There's one image of war as well. I'm only looking at one place, but there are 6 or 7 other such places which I have not studied in detail. And if one does, then one would get a better picture. But and this brings me to the place of origin. So these people, there are so many Sena ending and Pala ending names, of various kinds. They obviously emanate from somewhere in the plains of India, right? And these people are the traders, the Shrenis, the guilds, etc. Traveling up with their goods to to Central Asia, right? So the place of origin is not identified. This is what I said in the end. Neither the village, nor the caste identity, nor anything of that sort is mentioned in these fragments. And that is so significant. That's why I said these are communities of travelers. They had to coalesce with each other, love each other, like it or not, communicate with each other, like it or not. And the only thing is there were only 2 examples of women's names, and that also from the Sogdian inscriptions. Other than that, they are men of various castes and communities traveling together and being together and of course interacting. There's a social space of interaction. They had to all, in a snowstorm, they all had to be under those rocks or wherever to protect themselves, right? Huntington, I think, is it? Huntington. Yeah, he writes something in the 19th or 20th century where he says baleful after baleful of horses and things are found on the way. People died in snowstorms and in glacier attacks. Nobody touched those things, he says, in the 19th century, right? Is it Huntington? I think somebody...
And these traces keep appearing from time to time when the snow melts and so on, yeah?
Exactly. And that's what Winsang also writes.
Yeah. So this has been a very interesting paper with a very interesting discussion following it. Mark Bloch, I think somewhere in his Historian's Craft mentions that the historian should not become obsessed with origins. It's the process which is far more important. So now from Mlech Pradesh, let's go to Madhya Desh and find out what is happening to the margins there in the Hindi Patti. So Professor Badri, please.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me in this historic celebration of 100 years. And I observed how history happened. History happening, memory, remembrance, many things, which gave me, provided me opportunity to. Jarur, I'll finish before that in 19 minutes. So let me begin. I want to talk about relationship between identity and interaction in the context of Dalit and marginal community of the Hindi Patti. I don't need to define here. And identity provides opportunity, provides capacity to the community to interact with others. खड़ा होके बात करने की शक्ति identity provides. On the other hand, interactions reshapes identity. So it's a two-way process, the relationship between identity and interaction. But identity as an agency, I observed during my study, is liberative, but not emancipatory. Sometimes it begins and it provides you a maya that it is going to liberate you, but after some time you feel that it is creating similar kinds of pyramidal structure, hierarchy, structure of dominance, and create capillary holes, which sucks the benefits and resources of their own community That's why Ambedkar was very angry with this entire process, and he was very critical about the middle class, and he used to say that they don't pay back to their own community. So that kind of the nature of the identity. But identity begins with emancipatory feelings and also provides opportunity to the community to speak, provide them voice, and that representations, and that creates a condition in which the distribution of resources in democracy take place in which not equally, but looking like equal way. So here I'm going to talk about, whenever I discuss something about on the issue, I used to ask the audience, how many Dalit castes do you know? So just remember, so maybe 4 or 5 Dalit castes everywhere, in every university. People remember only 3, 4, 5 Dalit castes. And we have 66 Dalit castes in Uttar Pradesh, 22 in Bihar, and many in states, 50, 60, 70, but we know only 4, 5. Why? Because these 4, 5 have successfully cultivated their identity. So they become visible because, and most of them are have not able to cultivate their identity, so they are invisible. And what makes identity? What makes identity? During our researches, we observed that to make the identity, community needs identity resources. And in those identity resources, history is very important. So community history or caste history. But caste history or community history not in a oral form, in a written form. Without written, you don't have the authenticity. Because people ask, कहाँ है तो पढ़त लिखत की बात तो किताब में देखिए, किताब में हमारे बारे में ये लिखा हुआ है, बुक गजेटियर में ये मेंशन है हमारे बारे में, और इस किताब में ये. So you need a kind of text. That's why community started writing their own caste history and started publishing those caste history. We have collected more than 4,000 caste histories in our Dalit Resource Center in Allahabad, in our institute. So, if you make a kind of the table of those caste history, mostly a caste history were written by only 4 or 5 Dalit castes. Those who have capacity to write, those who have acquired capacity to write, those who have writer, community leaders, they are in fact able to tell about themselves. But more than 50 Dalit castes, those who are not even at the door of democracy, those who are not even able to knock the door of democracy, they don't have caste history. They have caste history in their oral forms, but not in a written forms. So, like Chamar, Pasi, Dhobi, Kori, all 4 or 5 castes, you can find caste history they have written, and they have published their caste history. So caste histories is one of the very important things which Kashiram used to again and again emphasize that without caste history, you can't create your identity. So you need caste history. And caste history written in a particular form, particular fashion, which makes you Raja, which makes you Rishi community, which makes you very knowledge community. Chamars used to claim that they are Ravidas, descent of Ravidas, Upach Rishi, so they are knowledge community. So where you are going? Through this kind of identity history, again you are going in the same circle of the field, where you are in the process of identity making, we imbibe many things of the dominant structure which you want to demolish, or which you want to demolish. So again in the same kind of identity structure, you are moving, claiming that we were Rajas, we were Rishis, we were this, we were that, the same structure. So it's not going to liberate and emancipate or create an alternative identity. It's the same identity discourse within that you are making your own space. But that space gives you sometimes freedom and also air, fresh air, and provide you capacity to speak. So that's the positive part of that identity making process. So caste history, and for the caste history you need to become educated. So you see the history of education, how it reached to the marginal community. And it's a very interesting history. The Chamars, Pasis, they used to take education even during colonial time. And entire history, how education came to them. Cantonment phenomena, colonial Sahab impact. Jaiswal used to work with the colonial Sahibs. Unke shoes, they're cleaning their shoes or the chamade ka belt and all. So they used to learn English. And if you see the list of English speakers during colonial time, you can find many Jaiswals were the English speakers, many Domes were the English speakers, many Dushals were the English speakers, and they used to tell, we used to speak Gorauti English. Gorauti English. We took interview of many of them, those who were worked in the cantonment area in Ambedkar, informed the Ambedkar Sabha and all. So they first of all, so colonial Sahab helped them to get their son admitted in the schools. And so colonial Sahab, our Samaj impact, the Muslim schools, through various ways, they reached the school, door of the school opened for them, and they acquired education. When they acquired education, they also acquired their own leaders. So forming caste association, the Ambedkar Sabha, Samka Sainik Dal, many kinds of organizations were formed in the cantonment area, mostly. So cantonment areas have very immense kind of empowering impact in the education process of education among Dalit community. So they acquired education, they produced their leader, and economy is very important because your community needs to come in a condition to save something. If you have saving, you can produce your politics. Most of these 50 community about whom I am talking, they don't have saving because they every day रोज कुआं खोदना रोज पानी पीना तो वो कहाँ से politics अपनी खड़ी कर सकते हैं कहाँ से अपने they are not able to send their children to the schools, so they are not able to produce their community leaders. So one is history in the form of booklets, education, community leaders. These are all very needed to form these are the identity resources through which you can form your identity. This community who are not able to cultivate their identity yet, they are very, they are not even, they have not their own politics. Politics, the chamas, when earn economic mobility through various kinds of leather business. In Agra and Kanpur, the Agra and Kanpur were leather center of leather business during First World War and Second World War. So they produced their own political parties. So RPI, and then are supporting Soviet Yashodharan movement in 1920, then RPI, and then the BSP. So all you can see the relationship between economic mobility and the identity making process. So the community who have not yet able to acquire their identity, they are in fact they are losing their space in democracy because they are not able to cry, they are not able to assert, they are not able to speak. So the benefits are not coming to them. They are being sucked by few castes or few communities of their own cluster, And that's why you must have seen there is a demand among many most marginal Dalit community that we don't want to remain in SC category. We want to shift in ST category. हमें ST category में ले चलो क्योंकि SC में we are not able to compete because हमारे यहाँ पढ़ा लिखा उस तरह का नहीं है and competition is very tough. So that kind of the processes you can observe. And even the benefits which are going to them, this whole notion of Labharthi, although this Labharthi is trying to disseminate their benefits among most marginal, mostly, because it has also political meaning and political strategy. They want to capture these most marginal communities in their political mobilization. So they are consciously trying to give them house or the various kinds of rice and various kinds of facilities to the community, but giving education, producing leaders, these are the long-term process. And here politics means the politics of emancipation need to do something so that this community can acquire their capacity to speak, acquire their capacity to aspire acquire the capacity to acquire and do politics of representation. They are lacking in that process. So that's the in that way identity sometimes gives you a kind of emancipate liberative condition and provides you political power also. But how it happens? I'll finish after giving 2-3 examples. We were surveyed BSP offices in Uttar Pradesh, and in many offices we found leaders. The head of the office was OST. That time Mayawati was chief minister. They were mostly OSTs, and they had a dhakki in the hand. Tilak, pan khate hue, people are coming and touching their feet, and they were giving Ashirwad. What is OST? OST, officers, special teachers. OSTs. Government people. Mostly government or semi-government or whatever, but they were like OST or OST. So पढ़ा लिखा एक बाबू जैसा कोई व्यक्ति बैठा हुआ है, and many leaders are coming and touching the feet of that person. So they were the real. And what we observed, the during our field works, that whenever this community acquire money, economic mobility, going to Vaishnav Yatra, going to organizing religious festivals. So religious aspirations is very much linked with the identity aspiration. What we do as an secular intellectual, we always negate this religious spheres in our discourse. But we were working in Bundelkhand, and it's surprising to see many communities, smaller community, Kabutra, Nat, Ragrej, Badik, Kuchbadia, mostly came from the forest areas. They came with they migrated, but they migrated with their deities. With them, their deities also migrated. So they brought their deities from there and put their deities under the people tree. Usme dhakka bandh diya, ghanti latka diya. And now they have aspirations that they want a big temple of these deities. And deity ka temple chahiye, that's their demand. And who will support this making of the temple for deities? I think secular politics has nothing to do with that. So mostly the Hindu Mahasabha and various kinds of even some organizations, and they are reaching to them and they are supporting to make this a small temple for them, collecting chanda, giving chanda to them. So these aspirations, you must have, if you go sometime Banaras, please visit. There is a village called Jayapura. This is the village adopted by Pradhan Mantri Narendra Modi ji. And in that village there is a Patti of the Muslims. And that Patti is called Atal Nagar. Uska naam Atal Nagar hai. It's a very modern Patti, you know, सब कुछ है वहाँ पे, यानी बिजली भी है, बढ़िया घर भी है, पानी भी है, everything. It's very well made and well maintained Patti. There is a small temple in that Patti they have made. In that small temple, there is a Shiva and Shabari. And Mushraf used to tell कि पूरे 50 कोस में हम लोगों को पहली बार सबरी का टेम्पल मिला है. हमारे पास तो कोई मंदिर ही नहीं था, पहली बार मंदिर मिला है. So that kind of aspirations we never consider in the making of identity process and how it works in the making of identity and aspirations of the Dalit and marginal community. We see only the everyday secular processes or material processes, but religious aspirations is also, and it is not new aspiration, it's a very old aspiration. You remember the Ambedkar struggle for temple entry. At that time there was a movement of temple entry, but now there is a movement of temple making. We need our own temple, and for them temple is not the temple that the meaning of temple that we have only. हमारे लिए मंदिर का क्या होता है, जाके पूजा करते हैं, चले आते हैं. For them, temple is a space where they sit together, they discuss their sukh dukh, they discuss their shadi vibah. So that's a space, public space for them also. When Mayawati makes this Ambedkar Park in Lucknow, it was widely criticized by media and our intellectuals. But when we were interviewing people, when that park made, हम लोगों ने 2 महीने कौन वहाँ आता है उसका हम लोग इंटरव्यू करते थे और क्यों आता है. So we observed that people from different part of India, Uttar Pradesh mostly, बाद में और जगह से आने लगे, they used to come there and they were very happy. वो उनका कहना था कि पहली कि हमारा सीना चौड़ा हो जाता है ये राजधानी में हमारा पार्क देख करके, जहाँ अम्बेडकर जी की स्टैचू हमारी राजधानी के इतने सेंट्रल प्लेस में बनी हुई, तो स्पेस has a meaning for the identity also. Identity is not in that way an isolated process. It creates its own space and it redefines the space. So that kind of things you can see in this identity configuration and identity discourse. So what I say, but after अच्छा बस तो मैं भी अब खत्म कर दूँ, अपनी बात समय खत्म हो रहा है तो जी जी, तो मैं यहाँ पर एक बात खत्म कह के अपनी बात खत्म करता हूँ और वो बात है कि व्हाट नेक्स्ट टू द आइडेंटिटी, जब आइडेंटिटी बन गई तो इसके बाद क्या होगा, एंड दैट क्वेश्चंस दिस आइडेंटिटी पॉलिटिशियंस आर नॉट एबल टू एड्रेस, and that is very basic question which we need to address for those who has acquired their identity. For those who have not acquired their identity, for them still we need identity. Identity is a very basic questions for them. And so here I'm going to stop, and if any questions will come, I will respond.
It's a very interesting presentation. I mean, we can have a question answer session because I think no, but that's a different topic. This is जब इन्होंने कहा इसके बाद क्या होगा, उसके बाद 2024 होगा, ठीक है, तो वो उसकी बात भी चलेगी अब, तो क्योंकि इन्होंने बड़ा दिलचस्प मौजू उठाया है कि वो अटल नगर में मंदिर बन गए हैं और उसमें वो अपने डिएटीज के साथ उन्होंने शबरी और शिव, उसमें अम्बेडकर साहब का भी लगा दिया कि छोटा सा पुतला नहीं है वहाँ, तो या तो अम्बेडकर के लिए मतलब बेसिकली यूजुअली जाटव्स एंड द चमार्स says are more interested in Ambedkar, the others are not so. Although Ambedkar himself was personally not very happy with the temple entry movement, which he used to say that it should not really be concerned about, but he was under tremendous popular pressure because of which he had to cave into that, but that's a different issue altogether. We'll have some questions now. Questions should be brief and they should not become presentations themselves. So, Santosh.
First of all, thank you very much. I just want to know how you see this identity politics going in next 20 years. There is a lot of Buddhist politics also going on in UP, and you are a man on ground. So how this so-called caste identity versus Hindu identity and then other marginal identities are going to interface? Thank you.
I see identity politics is in crisis, and identity politics will is losing day by day its the power of political influence, and that's why you can see the failure of Akhilesh Yadav and Samajwadi Party politics in Uttar Pradesh, BSP decline, constantly declining of the BSP political influence. And so it is in crisis. But you know, identity is like कहते हैं ना माया, जैसे मैंने कहा माया, it can any time reinvent itself, and it can reinvent in a new way, and with a new dress, सब कुछ नया हो जाएगा. So it can happen. Hindu identity versus caste identity, whenever this take place, अभी जो 30 years की history है वो बताती है कि हिंदू आइडेंटिटी कास्ट आइडेंटिटी को अपने में बाइक कर लेती है. उसका कारण है कि पॉलिटिकल एजेंसी विच इज इम्प्लीमेंटिंग द हिंदू आइडेंटिटी और एडवोकेटिंग द हिंदू आइडेंटिटी इज वेल ऑर्गेनाइज्ड, इज वेरी स्ट्रॉन्ग एट द ग्रास रूट, सो दे कैन टेक दिस डिस्कोर्स at the ground level, at the micro level, and imbibe the caste identity politics within that. Caste identity वाली जो parties हैं उनकी problem क्या है? They are appearing like social media, mostly working on social media, big leaders. So grassroots पर जो organizations थे उनके कमजोर हुए हैं, वो चाहे BSP को हो, चाहे समाजवादी पार्टी के उत्तर प्रदेश में, चाहे और राज्यों में भी हो.
बिहार में क्यों डिफरेंट है? The same kind of process.
We will follow one by one. I mean, kind of. Yeah. That's it.
After hearing response to Santosh, I'm getting a different question, but anyway, I stick to my first question. So I think we are talking the situation where I mean, with a simple question. I mean, what decides caste and who decides caste? I mean, so we are actually living in a country where caste reach before we reach. Any place we are talking about. So, as a Dalit, for example, in fact, I am not deciding my Dalitness. Someone else is deciding the Dalitness. So, I think the question about this emancipatory potential and the liberatory potential of caste. And my question is, unless, I mean, so how do you think that, I mean, so how this emancipation is possible? Because, I mean, if I remember correctly, Cornel West, one of the most important anti-racist philosophers. So he said, Negroness will not stop unless the white community get an anti-race education. Similarly, I think what we see now, so whatever you say, the emancipatory level will not reach unless the upper caste communities in India get anti-caste education. How is that possible?
Good question. Yes, I would extend your argument a bit further. That non-Dalit communities may be oriented towards various kinds of social reform movements, social reform consciousness, not only caste and many things. And now there is another discourse is emerging, which is very much linked with the Gandhian discourse. Hriday Parivartan. And those who dominate, those who oppress, there is need to change within their heart or their mind. So for that you need to do various kinds of work to change them. So that's one thing. But that does not make identity process, making of identity process irrelevant, because that's a process. Because when identity emerges, it gives you, it knocks you, then you realize, look, yes, we need to change ourselves. And then you are changing yourself. So it's a dialogic process. And you are very right that that we give them identity. We tell them that we tell them this and then that. Means others. We means the others. So it's emerged through dialogic process. So its response should also come through the dialogic process. And that dialogic process is that when identity appears, it raises its aspirations or its demand, then we realize their importance. So realizing importance, identity is needed, but identity is a transitory. It's not it's a goal. It's a process, and for that process, and Buddha also मैं नहीं जाऊँगा, बहुत लंबा समय लग जाएगा उस discourse में.
हृदय परिवर्तन, हृदय होगा तो परिवर्तन होगा. तो भाई साहब कुछ पूछ रहे हैं, आपकी बारी है, उसके बाद हम वहाँ जाएंगे. And then you spoke last time, so I'll give somebody else a chance.
You spoke about UP, but the same kind of identity we are not witnessing in Bihar, and Hindu identity is not getting much success vis-a-vis community identity. Why Bihar is a very different case?
Bihar is in that way is a different kind of in Bihar we have a different kind of social structure, society, caste population, caste profile. It's a mostly OBC dominant state. And you know, Bihar is in that way. आपको पता होगा कि जब आग अग्नि चली जलाते हुए जंगल को, तो बनारस में आकर रुक गई. तो बिहार में you can find a kind of empty consciousness of this kind of socialist politics. All the socialist politics were popular in Uttar Pradesh also. So that may be one of the OBC population, their politicization, their political consciousness in Uttar Bihar is at the grassroots level also. It's not. It's matter in that one.
बिहार बच गए. तो हाँ, आप कुछ पूछ रहे हैं. Can you just introduce yourself?
Thank you, sir. I'm Ashwin. I teach in Zakir Hussain College, Department of History. So I noticed a very serious note of critique about the methodology that mainstream history has adopted towards the study of society, whereas the former presentation talked about fragments remaining fragments, and questions about religion, etc., were almost brushed under the carpet. You have said that this is actually a practice of negation, and we need to look at religion through a different prism as far as aspirations are concerned. So, do you think that mainstream history writing need to change its stand towards religion and the way it gets factors in people's consciousness, and to be stay relevant in our times? Therefore, and how would you respond to this?
I think it is mainstream writing, history writing should change its way to see the religion. Not only history writing, entire intellectual discourse, the way they see the religion, we need to change. One thing is important in this context, that Dalit do research themselves for what? For unke swikar ke, they want their acceptance. So it's not nakar for constant nakar and nakar for nakar. Nakar for, because it's a social community, it lives with the adjustment. Everyday life में उनको जीना है, so they want acceptance, and for that it's a strategy. Identity is a strategy in that way. So they want acceptance, and acceptance. And लेकिन एक और चीज हो रहा है, मुझे लगता है कि एक मिनट में समझ लूँगा. That is appearing in new identities. जैसे अभी Buddhist identity की बात की क्वेश्चन के, state produce its own identity also. This Labharti has appeared as a big identity. And they are changing. Every state has its own Labharti. Congress के भी अपने Labharti. But they are making. They are continuously working with them and cultivating it as a consciousness. Labharti consciousness. And Labharti is community also. यानी चुनाव के पहले सारी लिस्ट बन जाती है. होली दिवाली में they used to go and have sweets with them. Yogi Adityanath appealed with to the BJP cadres that आप दिवाली में बनटंगिया घरों में जाइए, जिनको हमने घर दिया है उनसे मिलिए. So constant working with these groups, and in that 50% Dalit votes shifted towards BJP in last election in Uttar Pradesh, the state election. That is because of the state Labharti consciousness, which is changing this entire notion of Dalit consciousness. We feel very happy कि Dalit, हम सोचते हैं Dalit हमेशा radical होगा, Dalit हमेशा secular होगा, Dalit हमेशा pro change होगा. Dalit वो सारी चीजें चाहिए which we need. We means the others need. We means not I'm saying non-Dalit. So they are also, they have to live in the flux of in the longitude way of adjustment. तो उनको एक एडजस्टमेंट की ही उसमें रहना है, ये हमें समझना होगा, तभी नहीं तो हम ये मानते चलेंगे. That's why caste politics is diminishing or diluting day by day. But I am not saying that caste politics will disappear from India. It can appear again with a new meaning, with a new way, with a new dress.
I've been asked to speed up the process a little because we now have about 35 minutes, 40 minutes for the last part of this session. I now invite Dr. Chinmay Tumbe of the IIM Ahmedabad to deliver his presentation on Dalit business history in India. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you to the organizers. Absolutely delighted to be here. Hard act to follow after two wonderful presentations. Thank you, Professor Deshpande of the Samaivadi Party. Very important.
See, I will make you a Allahabadi later on.
All right. I'm based in a management school, and that's why I have a presentation. I've been teaching a course on business and economic history for a long time, and a question I get in class often is, tell us something about women in business history, tell us something about Dalits in business history, tell us something about so many things which people have not looked at business history. So I wrote a paper on women in business history last year, and this is a new project. I'm going to give, in about 20 minutes, a brief idea about how one might think about doing work on this, including some of the stuff that I'll be doing in this field. Does this click? Yeah. Okay, so 1984, Professor Dujain Tripathi, a pioneer business historian in India, you'll see he was at Ahmedabad, the institution I'm based in, edited a volume called The Business Communities of India. This is a session on voices from the margin, and I'm going to focus on businesses. Business Communities of India, you'll see the communities. I'm sure the people at the back cannot see it, but broadly this is covering Banyas, Gujaratis, Marwadis, Parsis, Khatris, Chettiars. These are the traditional business communities of India, broadly belonging to the Vaishya Varna order. And of course a few others, but broadly this is what we mean by traditional business communities, the mercantile castes of India. About 25 years later, Harish Damodaran, a journalist, wrote this wonderful book called India's New Capitalists, Caste, Business and Industry in a Modern Nation. And he had his first chapter called Traditional Business Communities, the old merchant communities, and then introduced the world of new communities in the world of Indian business. New in the sense that they were storming many, many fields, and a lot of these were agricultural based castes moving into the world of business. Think of the Saurashtra Patels and Diamonds and so on. And he has a last chapter 9 saying a note on the minorities. But this book basically concluded that there's really not much to find in Dalit and Adivasi business history. If you look at social composition of India's top firms today, it's not very diverse. So the largest 1,000 companies, if you take about 9,000 directors, about 45% are Brahmin, 45% are Banya. So 90% of pretty much corporate elite in India is Banya Brahmin, and this is 2010. This is, of course, top management, large companies and so on. The distribution is slightly different somewhere else. So if you look at this literature, of course, you'll think, there's nothing happening. There's Dalit business, what are you talking about? There's a huge dominance elsewhere. But there are books written in the last decade, and a new literature is emerging on Dalit business. This is not looking at history really. One by Devesh Kapoor, Chandrabal Prasad and Shambabu, define the rise of Dalit entrepreneurs. And of course, book chronicles successful Dalit business houses. Completely different perspective from my former colleague at this Hyderabad, Asim Prakash, wrote a book called Dalit Capital, showing how difficult it is for many Dalits to enter markets, how difficult it is to do business in India. So completely contrasting perspectives about this whole thing called Dalit capitalism. Very foundational moment in 2005 in business history of India. You have a lot of stuff on the Marwadi Samaj, on the Gujarati Samaj. I used to live in the US in a place called St. Louis, and we used to have events organized by the Gujarati Samaj of St. Louis. And this was pretty much, the Banya community within the Gujarati community. Caste-based associations, especially in the world of business, exist not only in India but around the world. In some places, you also have like a Gujarati Marwadi Samaj, so that is very rare. In 2005, India got something called as DICCI, modeled after FICCI, of course, Federation, called the Dalit Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And building on what Professor Badri was saying, a lot of this was about identity, about giving identity to the Dalit entrepreneur, forming a network. And what's interesting in Indian business history is that almost every community has an association. Almost every caste group has a business association in India now, especially in the MSME world. If you look at the distribution of enterprises in India, so not top companies, but enterprises, you'll find, of course, underrepresentation of Dalits and Adivasis. So, for example, this is work from the 2005 economic census, which looked at about 48 million economic enterprises. So this includes everything from your local shop just outside to even large firms. It's the largest enterprise level database. And it found, for example, not much underrepresentation for the OBCs, but substantial underrepresentation. So scheduled caste, 16% of the population, but less than 10% of enterprise. But 10% is still large. It's 10% of 35, 40, 36 million. So that's about 3.6 million enterprises which are owned and run by Dalit. So that's a huge number. however you look at it, even though it's a small percentage overall. And what's interesting is that really there's no history of this recorded. And so that's what this project is trying to do, trying to understand aspects of this history. So how might one start this project? First is of course to look at demography. This is a distribution of scheduled caste population in India at the district level. And obviously you're much more likely to find Dalit business history, so to speak. When I mean business, I'm talking about entrepreneurial history, or Dalits owning capital, top management positions and so on. So for example, western coast of India, very, very thin demography of scheduled caste, much more in the Gangetic Plain, for instance, much more in eastern Tamil Nadu. So obviously there are regional situations up here, even central Maharashtra to a certain extent. But what studies show, in fact, is that the underrepresentation is quite uniform. It's not that just because you have a higher share of scheduled caste, you have a higher share of scheduled caste in enterprises. So that underrepresentation is quite fairly uniform across the board. Now, having set this context, I'm going to now talk about how do we think about history. Three different ways. One is, of course, oral histories. And of course, I have just done one, which is a very recent one, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. The Industrial Census of 1911 is probably the most underutilized database in India. To the best of knowledge, ours is the first study to look at this. It's an amazing database which gives you caste level ownership of more than 6,000 firms in India. And you can see this across regions, you can see this, it's a very rich database that it's there embedded within the censuses, but it's scattered across different provincial reports. And so we've digitized this entire database. And of course, memoirs. Professor Badri mentioned a huge corpus out there. But I'm going to talk today about one particular memoir, which is a remarkable biography written in English in 1908 of arguably the first Dalit entrepreneur that we know about, an entire book-length treatment on that. So in terms of oral history, I helped set up the IMA archive. If you have in Ahmedabad, please drop by. Because this is an archive not only about IMA's history, but also about business history. We're collecting documents from a variety of places. But one distinguished individual that we interviewed for our oral history project is Dr. Tumbe. And Dr. Tumbe, of course, very few people know, had a whole corporate career before getting into sort of activism in academia. Interestingly, from Nagpur, first generation learner, kind of the standard route of education and upliftment in his own personal career. The transcript is in archive. If you're in Ahmedabad, you can see it. Was in the petroleum sector. Two key elements here. One is, of course, education, migration, and also the public sector. And the public sector unit as an important pathway to come up. I'm just highlighting this as one element, but there are a lot of more oral histories coming up from the student base of the IIM world. Right? A lot of students have excelled in the corporate sector, in the business sector in the last 50 years, and that's one way to think about how one might think of Dalits in top management positions around India. Shifting the time scale a bit further, the Industrial Census of India looked at about 6,000 firms. It looked at factories with more than 20 workers. So these are not very small establishments, they are fairly large establishments. And interestingly, you do find at least a few Dalit-run factories in 1911. Right? So this is, we think, the first real kind of exposition of that. To give you a sense of the numbers, of course, people at the back can't see, but this is 1911, different provinces. Broadly speaking, found in United Provinces, Bombay, Bihar, Assam, but about 22 firms, 20 odd firms, which were clearly Dalit-owned firms. These are private factories with more than 20 people. And you'll see, of course, that the OBC percentage aggregate in that time period is 18%. Now, this is, of course, backcasted data. There's no concept like OBC in 1911. So this is just, we have about 130 jatis represented in the industrial census. So we're just categorizing them based on today's classifications, right? Why are we doing that? Because we can compare them with today's data. And then, of course, Muslims slightly underrepresented, 15% of enterprises, when they had about 20% of population. But clearly, Dalits about 10% of population back then, and less than 1%, so huge underrepresentation. Not a single scheduled tribe enterprise back in 1911. If you look at the jatis mentioned in the industrial census, you have Chamar, Mochi, Nunya, Namaspura, Pasi, Poth, and Sundri. So these are the jatis mentioned, right? And they are found, of course, in different parts of India. broadly speaking, in leather, not surprisingly, but also mining, textiles, very surprisingly, and even metals and machinery, right? And so we're doing more work now on these particular sectors to understand what is happening. To give you a comparison of over 100 years transition, so less than 1%, if you focus on column 1, less than 1% of enterprises were owned by scheduled caste. That has increased now to 5% for comparable categories, that is 20 workers plus and manufacturing. And if you look at less than 20 workers, it's actually 11%. So today about 10% of enterprises in India are actually owned and run by Dalits. But you'll see the last rows basically show as firm size increases, those numbers dip from about 11% to 5% to 4%. Right? So overall, at scale, there is still very, very little representation. I'll now move to the memoir, which is, I think, the most interesting part of this project. It is only one book, but it's a fascinating book, a must-read kind of a book. It was discovered by Professor Jangam. He wrote this piece in the print, I think in 2021. So I happened to be in the British Library in London and got a copy of this book. And it's about Mr. Naglu, who set up the first hotel in central provinces. It's a remarkable book for many accounts. Not only written in English, but it's critical, it's funny, it's entertaining, and it's written by his son, who's extremely critical about his father's life. It's a fascinating account in biographical writing. So these are two editions of the book. It came out first in 1908. There were 100 copies of this book published, and of which most of them got lost. You can see the publisher is Hyderabad Deccan. In the Musi River flood of 1908, the book came out in 1908, and a few months or weeks later, the Musi flood of Hyderabad destroyed all the copies, most of the copies. So the son wrote another book in 1929 with revisions, with reviews of the first book, with some 15 appendix tables describing this whole journey. And it's 300 pages, it's very large, it has some illustrations as well. So broad structure of the book, it mentions the origins. Professor Badri was mentioning caste history, it's a fascinating account into the caste history. We're talking about the Mala caste out here in particular. And then each chapter is about specific episodes of the person's life. Mr. Naglu lived from 1828 to 1893. So this is how he looked. We also have an illustration in the book. So this is the parents of the author, who's the son of Mr. Naglu. Interesting caste history, that is, the caste was demoted. There was a famine in the late 18th century where this person was found eating beef, and so the local community basically downgraded the social standing of this particular caste. This one Mr. Govindu makes a little bit of money flying bullock carts to the British Army, and then his son wastes all that money away. He goes into witchcraft and sorcery, and he raids a granary during a famine in the early 19th century and lands up and dies in the Nellore jail. Then we have the protagonist, which is Mr. Naglu, who's born in Angol and very young age as an orphan. Brought up by uncles in Hyderabad and Jalna, and then flees. He hates his family. He goes out and starts off, as Professor Badri said, a lot of these cases he starts in cantonments. Think of Ambedkar's father also. In this particular case, does all sorts of odd jobs for the British officials, but then starts also on the mutiny campaign, fascinating travelers' accounts of the mutiny in central India of this time, and then eventually settles in Nagpur, is in the railway sleeper contracting business for some time, and then eventually starts the first hotel of central provinces in 1864. So remarkable kind of life trajectory, and the book has a lot of details of precisely how caste intersects with the challenges of doing business. It's amazing how much is documented in the book on that particular aspect. Different aspects, as I said, it's a very critical book. It talks about all the sins of the father, in this particular case, the author. To build on what Professor Badri was saying about religious identity, he built a lot of temples dedicated to what they call as non-Aryan gods, and one of them was on smallpox, again the context of 19th century pandemics. First marriage did not work out, known to be very charitable, donated a lot of money for famine relief and so on. His high period was in the 1860s. By 1870s he had expanded, he had some more hotels, and then about 1879 Europeans sue him. He runs up a lot of debts, and by 1880 he's pretty much finished. So it's a story of the rise and fall of a particular entrepreneur. But in the 1860s and 1870s, he's doing very well. In fact, the Tatars, who start the Empress Mills, offered to bail him out, but the Europeans, really fleece him on the end. Interesting accounts of the perspective of travelers about the hotel, which is run by a Dalit of that time. So there are clear references to how travelers see this. But precisely because this is a very entertaining and affable person, gets along well with a lot of people. The photograph of the hotel, which was run by Mr. Naglu in Central Provinces, it's called the Residency and Railway Hotel. By most accounts, this was converted to the main railway headquarters now that you see in Nagpur. So a remarkable kind of story. I have, of course, gone to Nagpur and tried to trace out various aspects of the photographs. Unfortunately, not much is remaining. I have been to the Vidarbha State Archives in Nagpur. Not too much, some information, but not too much. My next trip will be to Bhopal. Different accounts of this particular hotel about first comforts of a first-class hotel. I remember we're talking of a Dalit entrepreneur in the late 19th century. Some snippets from the Times of India calls in that enterprising Madrasi, Naklu of Nagpur, and so on, a model hotel. But by 1879, there are debt and court cases which stack up against this individual. There are caste complaints. So Naglu is appointed as the dispute resolution chief for the Madrasi castes in Nagpur. And 18 castes, he's supposed to represent 18 castes in Nagpur. And the others can't stand it because how could this person be appointed? So there's a copy of this letter in the appendix of this book which says we don't like this appointment and this person should be gently removed from this position. There's an account of the Malayan poetry, again the caste history. His tomb, a photograph of his tomb, desperately trying to locate it. By most accounts, it's not there. Maybe something has been built over it. This is Jalnath Sarkar writing a review of his book, right? So incredible that Jalnath Sarkar would write a story, and he calls it the life story of a great pariah. Right? So a fascinating account of that. Some last kind of different reviewers of the book call it the story of the rise of Anand from the lowest of the low to a place of honor and respect, and so on. The ordinary fate of the Malas, unless they come within the missionary fold, is to live and die unseen, unknown, and unlamented, with not a stone to tell where they lie. But Naglu is a singular exception. So it tells you a bit about the time that he comes from. So with that, I'll end. As I said, a long way to go for this project. But if you know memoirs which mention business, please let me know. If you're in Ahmedabad, please visit the IMA archives. These are the books I've written. Some of the stuff we do on histories on social media, at the BizEconHist on both Twitter and Instagram. And we do have a conference coming up in September 1st and 2nd. Since many of your students, we have a fully funded PhD student workshop on August 31st. So the announcement for this, there is a website already there, but the announcement will happen next month. So if anyone's working on business and economic history, see you at IMM. Thank you.
What an interesting presentation, and what a sad thing that we have been asked to take only 2 questions. So, because in 10 minutes we'll have to go and have lunch. Maybe just 5 more minutes. So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A, as they say. Right? So you have questions. It's very interesting presentation. I mean, in fact, anyway, we'll speak later. So I don't want to ask all the questions myself.
But before that, one.
Yeah, please, we'll begin there. And then.
I'm just asking you to speak more.
No, what's your question?
My question is that what does Jalnath Sarkar say about him, where, and what do other significant people of India at that time say about him? So I'm just asking you to speak more.
No.
Yeah, it's a lovely review. It's worth just seeing the review. It's a glowing account. There are 2 longish reviews, and that's what he's basically describing the book. A large part of the review is that, but literally every sentence is Mr. Sarkar saying stuff like, this is remarkable, absolutely remarkable, and so on. He does end though by saying this, that because the son, and there's a book chapter in the edit on the son, whose name is Venkataswamy, who writes a lot of stuff on folklores and so on. So he's a writer. He's a popular writer in the early 20th century who's written this book. Jagannath Sarkar does end this by saying, this is an important book to be read by all Hindus to understand the evils of the caste system and so on. And the son, Venkateswamy, should be accorded the Brahmin status because of his great contribution, just like the Upanishads would say and so on. So that's in the last paragraph of the review, which is quite interesting. And there are, of course, not other, I have not found enough reviews from maybe celebrities of those times on the scale of Mr. Sarkar, but the book itself has many reviews put at the end. And what's amazing is there's some reviews also critical of saying, you know, this is just a book about the father. He's put that as well, right? So it's a really critical biography of one's father. And Professor Jangam thinks it's the first Dalit biography in English. I don't know how true that is. But it is a remarkable book, which I hope Professor Jangam edits and brings it out for the wider audience very soon.
What do they say about Nizam and...
We'll move to the next question. Somebody wants to ask something?
Fascinating. I think fascinating. So I just want to comment on two aspects of it. Chinmay, you know this well. One is you mentioned it, but you didn't develop it further. It's linked to migration, because that's one big story which is there about, say, from Andhra Pradesh, people going to Burma and coming back. What Narayan has written about this golden land and all. So there is some aspect of the story of migration, moving and accumulation of capital of certain amount. I don't know whether it really translates. That's one question. Second is about this the data that you have. It's true that this is you have a snapshot in 1990, but if you have a historical trajectory, is it possible to argue in one way, at least from the textile industry perspective, from southern India, we know there was a much greater concentration of what was known as pariah weavers and weaving groups in the early 19th century, which declines, as opposed to in North India, where the what you call the weaving groups come in as a kind of as the other people leave weaving, they come in. Kori weavers, for instance. So I was just going to say, is there a long-term history, instead of seeing it only as emerging in the because of, has a long-term history that there is some decline which takes place, and then you have this, that's the idea of exception. Because we know late 19th century, late 18th century, at least in Ravi Ahuja's work, there is a mention of a large number of pariah soldiers, for instance, and many of them, in very nice, very interesting dresses, and so there's some kind of notion of petty capital formation, petty capital accumulation. So I just wanted to place these two, the migration and the long-term history.
I would like to add one question. What happened to this family?
Okay, so I'll answer this first. So we don't know. This is like a parallel project between Professor Jangam and me, and both are obsessed about this particular thing. Definitely trying to go into Nagpur and all the scouting locations. It's very tough, but I think at some point, we will. Unfortunately, the business we know does not survive, but the son is like a literary star. So hopefully, some remnants. On migration, yes, I think all the accounts from Devesh Kapoor's recent work on Dalit entrepreneurs, to even Asim Prakash's work, there's no doubt that a disproportionate number of these Dalit entrepreneurs people are finding in history happen to be migrants. And at least the recent oral testimonies clearly tell you that migration is almost central, saying that an important thing is because entrepreneurship is a lot about failure. You keep failing and maybe one idea succeeds. Failure in your home ground is punishing, right? Because people say, you tried something different and you stick to what we are being ordained to do. But when you're in a new place, you can choose to fail more basically in a new place. And so migration seems to be quite central. Having said that, of course, the numbers tell you less than 1%. There is a lot of migration of various communities happening here, and very few end up in entrepreneurship. So I don't think migration leads to this, but it's interesting that a lot of the examples you find happen to be a person leaving, running away, and then starting. So I think that's how I see that. The second one, honestly, I don't know, but that's hopefully something that this project will uncover. When we started, we had absolutely no name. This is how I started my project on women in business history. Not a single name of women in business history of India. Not a single name. And as entrepreneurs or top management. And then we found 100 names. So hopefully this project will build this going forward. So this is a very rough cut, and I'm sure a lot of you have interesting ideas. Happy to discuss that over lunch.
I have a question about data.
Afterwards, we wind up.
Data that, I mean, about the presentation, but the data that you spoke about, it is in terms of the percentage, say in the position of directors, etc., etc. Now, big firms, as you know, control more capital, and much more now, as you know, the greater concentration of capital with the bigger people. So, have you also tried to then see the share, capital share of the Dalit entrepreneurs in the overall, whatever GDP that you would like to?
Okay. Yeah, great question. No, I've not done that yet, but now that you've told me, it's an easily doable project. You can have imputation of this. All we know is the distribution of total enterprise of India, which is in millions, and we have, of course, total corporations. Unfortunately, the economic census does not give you too much monetary data. You can see number of people employed, but not really total capital employed. But it is in theory, but there's no doubt, as I mentioned, 90% of the top is literally to Varna orders. And obviously that's where capital is concentrated. So there's no doubt that the 10% of enterprise ownership among Dalits is going to fall when you weigh it with the size of the firm and so on. So definitely that's something will be done. Having said that, of course, there are big companies now, which are Kamani Tubes, for example, run by Kalpana Saroj, Dalit woman, phenomenal story of rags to riches out there. So these stories, of course, are emerging.
So we'll have one last question by Yasser, and that's it.
Before the question, in fact, I was kind of shocked to know that the hotel was auctioned for 10,000 rupees. And when we're talking about it in the last quarter of the 19th century, because I was also converting the old rate yesterday for my own work, it will be more than like 25 crore rupees. I mean, so that's the amount we are kind of talking about in the last quarter of the 19th century. So, but the question is, I mean, so what happens before this migration and also when he's taking up his entrepreneurship? So, because we are talking about a period where we have lots of emphasis on this Vidya Udyog kind of a debate. I mean, so education and also industry. I mean, so when we look at Narayan Guru or maybe Phule or this kind of what is a social reformist activities and the movements, intellectual activities. So, is there any kind of intellectual instigation that he got from this kind of discourses?
Yeah, great point. The book is very silent on all these other voices. If anything, missionaries do pop up. Reviews, he says, my good friend, Reverend, so on and so on. Jadunath Sarkar does mention this, saying, this is a great example of success without converting. So that is what Jadunath Sarkar says in his review. So the book is silent. So it's very tough to decipher if there are these, maybe it was in the air, but it's not in the book. The closest the book comes, it does mention missionaries in a lot of pages. But he's very clear that he wants to build temples of a different type and so on. And again, as a personality description, it's just a fascinating read. So yeah, I think we're out of time, so we'll continue our discussion outside. Thank you so much.
So, but don't think you can go to lunch so easily. Because I sit between you and lunch. And I have been requested to say a few sentences. I don't think myself equal to the task. Because these have been three extremely, very intense and very interesting presentations. They are diverse, yet they converge on topics which have contemporary relevances, contemporary resonances also. Deeply historical, yet contemporary. And I think we will continue this discussion over lunch and thereafter. And I think it's been a good session. It has kicked off the Centenary seminar very well. Thank you everybody for your patience. And I thank all the three speakers for having regaled us with such excellent presentations. Thank you everybody. Okay, now we can go for lunch.
I would like to invite Professor Jaya Tyagi to facilitate our esteemed speakers and then
Not facilitate. They have facilitated us. I mean, we need to facilitate them. So you cannot blame me now, okay? There will be blamed if something, is delayed. Steady state, okay, very good.
There is only one person anyway who can be blamed for everything.
Start with the chairperson.
Oh.
He's being so.
Hello, yes.
How?
I would like to request our esteemed speakers, faculty, college teachers and students to join us for lunch. However, I would also like to inform the students that they would be required